In the meantime, our presenters have taken their places on this stage. And this evening in particular, and the quest for serendipity in general, would not be possible without the work of the Technology Office at IST Austria. Its head, Markus Wanko, is here to introduce the team and the technology transfer ecosystem here at IST Austria, please. And I think we'll take this mic, as Maria has taken hold of the other mic.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
The floor's yours.
Babak, let me just quickly thank you for the very encouraging words and I think the enthusiasm that you are spreading here, which is really appreciated. Let me also say, if my son, who is 11 now, comes home with Twitch, we have an issue, I think, right? It's also really an honor to talk after, what was it, $22.6 billion annual research budget. So if my role is now to introduce very briefly what we are doing here at IST and what we did over the course of the last year, then this is a slightly more modest budget. Basically, we are organizing our work in 3 different lines. The first line is really the tech transfer office that Oliver mentioned before, which, and basically, in order to keep me brief, we decided we would refer you to our web presences. So we are going to show you basically the 3 homepages for these 3 different lines of activities. So please feel free just to peruse this and then look up in detail what we have been doing. The Tech Transfer Office is basically the place that internally at IST helps our research to develop their ideas, right? And I won't say anything more about the individual ideas because we have 5 brilliant examples of researchers on the stage here. To talk about what's happening at IST. At the office, what we basically do is that we develop the intellectual property, try to manage and protect it properly, organize courses and events. We have a fellowship program that allows researchers to focus for a certain period of time really on a dedicated translational project. So this is essentially what we do at the Tech Transfer Office. Since you have been talking about money already before as well, then obviously funding ideas is a very important element as well, which is where IST Cube comes into play. That's the venture fund that we introduced at the Science Industry talk last year, actually. It is a structure that allows private investors who are interested in investing in supporting interesting science and commercial projects to invest on the one hand, and it really is dedicated to the Austrian spin-off scene as a whole and not only IST Austria spin-offs. So we are investing in spin-offs and supporting spin-offs from all other academic institutions that we have in Austria. So far we have made, and this is the reference to Cube, we have made 4 investments. These are the examples here. I think we have Lisa here from Prewave, we have Harold obviously here on stage from Ribbon, and Chiara from Vitrolab. They are also from all different institutions. That's one spin-off from the Technical University, one from the Medical University, one from the main university in Vienna, and one close to home. This is essentially IST Cube. It's a fund that we so we have started operations. We hope to close it finally at the end of Q1 next year at a target size of 40 million. So it's still open for investors who want to join. And last but not least, the aspect that's also quite relevant is access to infrastructure and space. The minister has been kind enough to refer to the opening of the tech park that we had 6 weeks ago. IST Park, which is basically currently the first phase of a potential bigger project. We have 2 buildings that give access to office and dedicated lab infrastructure, so molecular biology lab infrastructure. We have 10 companies already there. I think it's starting to get lively. There's still some room left as well. If companies have an interest and want to be close to the institute, then just please feel free to see us. And when I say see us, what's really important to me is that not only to present these different initiatives that are mutually reinforcing and I think make sense to support the different initiatives that we have, but they're also structured in a different way, obviously. The one is a real estate project that's structured differently. The other one is a fund. But it's all managed by one team, and I just really want to quickly ask the team to come on stage. I think what we have managed is not so much this project, but actually to put a team together that is, from our perspective, really quite impressive. So we have Ingrid Kelly, who is a molecular biologist by training, Cambridge trained, a European patent attorney, very knowledgeable in all areas of intellectual property, obviously. Extremely glad to have you here. We have Alex Schwartz here, a Harvard-trained chemist, who spent the first part of his career with McKinsey as a management consultant, I think found his way back to science, and is also very glad about this. We have Florian here, who joined us, Florian Resch, most recently, who is dedicated for the venture fund IST Cube, brings considerable venture capital investment experience. We have Bernhard Petermeier, who joined us from Switzerland, who is a computer scientist originally, gathered experience with ABB Ventures in Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, headed a EPFL Lausanne spin-off as a CEO. Very glad to have you here as well. Alex Fischl, not least, actually our longest standing member, I would say, a tech entrepreneur as well, who is running the entrepreneurship lab here, and is, well, fixing everything else that's not working. Actually, fixing everything else that's not working is Elizabeth, and we have, well, we don't have you here, but obviously Elizabeth in the second row here, please stand up, is really the good soul that we have. So anyway, very happy to have all these people here, and then hand over to Alex to introduce the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much. After having heard so much about IST and how great IST Austria actually is, we get now an opportunity to actually lift the lid a little bit and get a view onto the inside and see what's actually happening here on the scientific part of it. So to this part of the evening, we have put together a panel of 5 professors and 1 entrepreneur who had a career at IST before. And they will give an idea of the breadth of research happening here. But what you will also see is that their work is at a very different level of maturity on this arch, from basic research towards a company that is actually using their developments, their results, and marketing their things. So they will give us an idea in a series of 5-minute talks what they're doing, and they will make reference to these stages of innovation, and sometimes also to what kind of support structure, you heard about it, IST Cube, IST Park, Tech Transfer Office, what kind of support they receive, and you see how all these things come together actually to form an ecosystem that hopefully will make the vision true that we had at the beginning. This institute is very much modeled after Weizmann. There's very much Weizmann blood here in the idea of IST. So in a few years, hopefully, that IST Park will not be 1 or 2 buildings right now, but maybe a couple of high rises where we see that science and industry actually really came together in a very successful way. And this will give you an idea about what's happening here. And after these presentations, there will be a panel discussion between our professors and our entrepreneur here, and 3 people that will debate and comment on what they have seen and provide maybe some also advice from their background and experience to the Institute, and specifically those on the stage. So very much looking forward to the next part of this evening.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you. Okay. I'd like to ask Babak Parvis back on stage and Stefan Dertinger to join us here so that you have a good view of what is coming up. Alexander mentioned it. Yes, please take a seat. Alexander mentioned it. Now, we will have 5-minute speed talks from each of you. If you wish, I can signal you if you have 1 minute left. I see you wish to do so. And in addition to this constraint, I'm asking all of you to point to possible moments of serendipity in your careers, which makes it easier for us to tie back to the subject of this evening. And then we will have the responses from the panelists. Let's start with Assistant Professor Yorgos Katsaros, researching nanoelectronics.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry, let me take the pointer. When you watch little children growing up, you will immediately notice the intrinsic nature of human beings to try to discover the world. Just give them a pile of Lego bricks, for example. They will try really to understand how to connect them. They might be interested seeing different colors, but definitely they will not try to create anything useful. That's what's basic research to me. However, eventually, as they get a bit older, they might get a bit more skilled. They will start making some more complicated constructions, and some of them might even build something useful, which could be a house for the Lego family. Next slide. So what are we doing in my group? In my group, we are trying to understand how the world works at very low temperatures. In 1947, that device was invented in the Biolabs. That device is simply what we know as a transistor, which is nothing else than a switch which allows the flow of electrons. And that transistor, that switch, has allowed us to do logical operations and practically has revolutionized the world. In my group, what we try to do, we try to investigate very tiny transistors. By now, those transistors, which back at that time were a few centimeters large, they have become smaller than a human hair. So what we try to do is to fabricate such type of transistors, cool them down at low temperature, and understand quantum effects. What you can see, for example, here is such a nano device. What you can see here are just two metallic lines. They have a height of 30 nanometers, 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. We take this device, we put it in such a machine, which is called a dilution refrigerator, or else simply a fridge, with the only difference that that fridge can go down to minus 273.14 degrees Celsius. Why are we interested to do this? Well, effectively, making such type of devices, we can trap single electrons. And if you apply a magnetic field to a single electron, you can create a so-called quantum bit. What is a quantum bit? Different to a classical bit, which can be either 0 or 1, a quantum bit can be at the same time 0 and 1. And that's a bit difficult to understand with our normal logic. But luckily, if we think of them as waves, think of the state 1 as this type of wave. State 0, it's a rather more complex. But we can all imagine this type of combination of the waves. That would be our superposition of our qubit. Why is this interesting? Before I move to this point, next slide, I would like to tell you actually how do we create these very, very small devices. For this, we need the dedicated infrastructure of IST Austria. What you can see here is an electron beam lithography system which allows you to create metallic lines down to 10 nanometers, once more, 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. And just to give you a feeling what we do in the nano fabrication facility where my group is spending quite a bit of time, imagine that you want to create such a metallic line, which here would be this double pattern. We want to create two lines. We start with some substrate. We cover it with a type of polymer. Then we use the electron beam lithography tool, which allows us to create an electron beam with a spot of 2 nanometers. We expose certain areas. When we do this, polymer bonds can break. We take our substrate, we dip it into a liquid, which dissolves that areas. We put it into metal evaporator. We deposit material, for example, gold. We put it in another liquid, which dissolves completely the polymer. And like this, we are able to create very, very thin metallic lines. What we then need to do, we need to measure our devices. So we need dedicated printed circuit boards and filters in order that we can really see the delicate quantum effects. Next slide. So I told you we want to do quantum bits. We want to generate quantum bits. So why do we want to do this? Because there is the big dream that maybe one day we will be able to realize a quantum computer. So what's the difference of a classical computer to a quantum computer? If you have a bit, it will be in the state 0 or 1. If you combine n bits, you will be in one out of the 2n possible combinations. If now you move to the quantum world, you will have this bizarre quantum coin, which can be at the same time both blue and red, so both 1 and 0. If you combine now n of these bits, you will be able to be at the same time in all the 2n combinations, and that might allow us to simulate quantum systems, things which we will never be able to do with any classical PC. We'll be able to realize it? Well, nobody knows. What's for sure is that we are going to generate a lot of knowledge on the way, and who knows, maybe we will come up also with a completely different application. After all, it's all about serendipity. Thank you very much.
Christoph Pietrzak, researching cryptography.
Okay, well, I was just allowed one slide, so that's it. And so my name is Christoph Pietrzak. I'm a cryptographer. So cryptography is the basic science behind information security. And I was asked to tell a few words about how the basic research we do in our group and our community in general gets disseminated into practice, into real-world products. But before that, maybe let me mention some of the more applied real-world topics that we work on in my group. So this is on the upper right there. So one topic, for example, are sustainable blockchains. So I think all of you have heard about Bitcoin. It's the first decentralized currency, digital currency. It's vastly successful, and you might also have heard that it's kind of extremely unsustainable and wasteful, because its security relies on the assumption that the majority of the hashing power dedicated towards securing this blockchain comes from honest parties. And at the current point in time today, more electricity goes into securing Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain, than used by all of Austria, for example. So we were thinking about how can we use maybe a different resource than computation to implement this blockchain. Another topic that is kind of interesting and applied on memory hard functions. So here the question is the following. Can we construct functions whose cost in evaluating this function is basically as high on your laptop or on the server as it would be on super dedicated special hardware that an adversary could have? And cost means electricity cost, hardware cost, and so on. So these functions are very useful. They have applications for securing passwords and other things. Okay. A fourth topic would be lightweight cryptography. What do I mean by this? So we have very good cryptographic objects for basic cryptographic tasks like encryption, authentication. They are great, but when you have like a device like this, so this is a public transportation card from Portugal, I think. So it has a chip in it, a tiny little chip and an antenna. These things cost about 10 cents or something like that. And these devices are simply too weak to implement the cryptographic schemes we have. So we kind of work towards constructing cryptographic schemes which are so simple and efficient that they can even be implemented on such devices so that you can actually have strong authentication, for example, for your public transportation card. Maybe let me the fourth and last topic I would like to mention is group messaging. So I think most of you, or many of you probably have some messaging app on your phone, like WhatsApp or Signal. And I don't know if you know this, but these messaging apps have actually amazing security properties. So not just end-to-end encryption, they have things like forward security. So things if your key gets compromised, messages in the past are secure. Post-compromise security, even if your device is hacked now, if you make an update and the virus or something is gone, messages in the future are secure. But what does not work at this point in time is these protocols do not scale to many parties. So the question is, can we have messaging protocols for groups of 1,000 people or something that have these great security properties while not giving up on efficiency, not having point-to-point channel, but something efficient. Okay. So now, exactly. If we work on those topics, and now the question is how, if we think we have something that is great that the world should know about, maybe we invented it or somebody else invented it, how do we kind of make sure that these things get out in the real world? So I have like two pipelines. So the upper one is the standard pipeline. So both of them start with the basic research. We publish papers, very technical papers with proofs. We send them to peer-reviewed conferences. They get accepted or not. And so that's the first step. And if we then think this should go out, we have to do some work. So there are basically two options. One is we go to some open standardization body, for example, the IEFT, Internet Engineering Task Force. This is like a body where you kind of can come with a proposal that is for historical reasons called the request for comments. It's not, it's a proposal, and this might or might not get into practice, and at some point you have a standard, and companies will only adapt it. Actually, 2 years ago, I would have told you companies will only adapt the cryptographic primitive if it's kind of standardized by somebody. Now, this has, at least for our group, dramatically changed with these blockchain applications, because there, when we came up with the new cryptographic building blocks, things like proofs of space. So this is a proof system where you waste space, not computation, to have sustainable blockchains or verifiable delay functions, proof systems to prove that some amount of time has passed. Really, those companies like the Ethereum Foundation and others were just waiting for these things because there are no alternatives, and they immediately started implementing these things. Along the way, there were lots of competitions where they threw out a lot of money in open competitions for people to implement those things or to find bugs in those things. And in fact, so this actually my most recent research is actually applied in practice, whereas the other, so the blockchain research, whereas memory at function, all these other things are still somewhere in this phase, and maybe we see them in a decade or two, or maybe not. So thank you.
Maria Ibanez, functional nanomaterials. Floor's yours.
Hi, good night, everyone. And I want to think like how materials are made. They are made of atoms, and how these atoms are organized and which are those atoms determine the properties of the material. So now imagine that we can build materials that doesn't follow the strict rules that atom bonding require for building up the material. So this is one of the things that my group is doing. And the strategy we follow is by using nanoparticles. And we use them like a building blocks. So a bit of like analogy that Georgos make with the Lego, but I make a bit of a different one, maybe more realistic, with the bricks. And we can imagine the nanoparticles as if they were bricks. And with them, we build the material we want. And why is this special compared to atoms? It's because these nanoparticles, that basically means we shrink the size of the material very, very little to the nanoscale, like around 1 million times smaller than the human hair. It has very special properties that depend on the size, the shape, and the composition. And we can, in my group, we can synthesize these nanoparticles very precisely. We can control the size and make very monodispersed nanoparticles. We can also control their shapes and the composition, and therefore the properties of each individual of these artificial atoms that we will use to build the material. Once we have these nanoparticles, what we can do is play with their surface. So they are so tiny that the surface is a very important parameter. And we can introduce new properties to either glue the nanoparticles like cement does in a wall, or we can also like add ons like new properties with the interface between the nanoparticles, or promote sintering between the nanoparticles, so we can control how they are attached to each other. And the third important parameter when we build materials with these artificial atoms that are the nanoparticles is how we organize them. So we have the control during the assembly of these particles, and we can create materials that have glassy configurations, which basically means they are disorganized. And this means different interaction between the particles. We can also synthesize these solids or nanocrystal-based solids in such a way that the particles are extremely organized and they have precise positions on the solid, like atoms has in a crystal. Therefore, we have artificial crystals made by nanoparticles where we have control properties like optical emissions, magnetic properties, and so on. So once we have these solids, what we do in my group is investigate how the charges transport within, or how the phonons transport, so thermal and electrical properties of these nanocrystal solids. And we can find very different outcomes than when we check natural materials that come out in our nature. Next slide, please. So when we check these materials, one of the applications that always have captivating me is thermoelectricity. And for those of you who don't know, thermoelectricity is basically the direct conversion between heat and electricity. So we have different temperature in a material, and the part that is hot excite the carriers or the electrons, and then they move through the material. So basically, when we have a temperature difference, we have a current, electricity. How simple is it, no? It's just, there are everywhere difference of temperatures that can be used for harvest electricity. And there are many, it's so simple in the sense that it's just a material generating electricity that at the end we can design many different devices. I have here 4 examples of the devices that can be produced. One, for example, is with textiles. We can have an energy harvester generate heat, electricity just by the heat of your body. You can also make it very adaptable for different configuration, for gas pipes or water pipes that has huge different temperatures. We can make flexible devices or very, very tiny devices. So we can use this technology to use to power the Internet of Things, wireless sensor, or waste heat recovery. But why we don't use it? It looks amazing, no? But there is a clear problem with this. The efficiency is too low. Materials that exist in nature doesn't provide enough efficiency to make this cost effective. So what are we trying to do in my group? We are trying to make these metamaterials and see if we can escape the rules that control them to improve the performance. And while most of it is basic science, we target to get these new high-performance materials. And maybe also we can capture serendipity in the way.
Thank you. You're doing great. You're doing great. Bernd Bickel is next, computer graphics and digital fabrication.
Yeah, I'm just staying here. So, yeah, I'm a computer scientist, and my research is about linking computational methods with advanced fabrication techniques, such as, for example, multi-material 3D printing, as you can see on the left-hand side, but we are also using some more traditional manufacturing methods as an application scenario like injection molding, as you can see on the right-hand side. Now, our focus is on developing novel representations and algorithms that allow software actually to design structured materials, but also geometrically complex objects that have interesting functionality. For example, as a very simple example, an object that is very lightweight, but also very strong, or maybe something that mimics certain appearance properties, or has some other interesting optical or mechanical functionalities. Now, this software that we develop, of course, also needs to understand the capabilities, but also the limitations of the fabrication device, so that we can make sure whatever is computed is actually also manufacturable. And now, 3D printing and traditional manufacturing methods, they do not only differ by what you can build, but next slide, please. There is also another big gap here, and that is, for example, when it comes to 3D printing, there is the promise that you can manufacture objects by doing a simple click. So it's very straightforward to build something with a 3D printer, but it has one drawback, and that is scalability. So if you think about if you print one object, or if you print 10 objects, then the 10 objects approximately take 10 times as long and also cost 10 times as much. So doesn't scale so nicely. Now, on the very other hand, there is molding. It's a very well-established industrial process, and it's extremely efficient and scalable. So basically, the machine just has to close the mold, plastic is injected into the mold, cools down, so it solidifies, mold opens, and your part is ready. However, there is a problem with the molding process, and that is that you actually do need a mold. And it turns out that actually designing a mold is a quite complex, non-trivial task that is costly and also usually requires human expertise. Now, it has turned out that actually by chance, we came up with some algorithms that are extremely well suited for actually doing automated mold design. So currently, we're actually having a proof of concept running where we're trying to develop a software prototype that can be used for automatic mold design. And I'm actually very proud that tonight I can show you the very first result that was computed with our software. So given this input, for example, these glasses frames on the left-hand side, this model, our software fully automatically computed this mold design on the right-hand side. And we're now in the next phase working together with an industrial partner to actually manufacture this, but also try our software on many different other types of objects. So, you know, this proof of concept is made possible, first of all, through an ERC proof of concept grant. So this, to a large extent, funds this development. But also, we of course get great support for this from infrastructure that is here at IST. For example, the machine shop that allows us to do certain tests here. But also the tech transfer office that, for example, helped us in a tremendous great way to actually protect this IP. And all of this actually now enables us to, with this proof of concept, actually see what is the commercial potential of this idea and evaluate this. And I hope that maybe in a year I can tell you, oh, this has led to a successful startup. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Gaia Novarino, genetic and molecular basis of neurodevelopmental disorders.
I'm too Italian to sit still there. Let me start just giving first a brief introduction about what my group does, and then I will go a bit in detail about what we are trying to do together with, actually, with the support of the Technology Transfer Office. So my group is focused on research, or try to understand the basis of autism. So nowadays, actually, we don't use this term anymore, autism. We use the term autism spectrum disorders. This is a group of disorders that are characterized by social deficits. So kids with autism eventually are not very capable of making social contact, and eventually have a problem in speech, delay in speech development. They also have a specific signature like repetitive and stereotype behaviors. Now, those were thought to be very rare disorders, but in fact they are not, and the number that is there is true that autism actually affects about 2% of the population. That means that 2 children in 100 are affected by those disorders. This is a very high number. So, actually, those disorders are often, those core symptoms also go together with a number of other symptoms that are very severe. So there are a few problems, next slide please, that concern to those disorders. First, the diagnosis, the tools to make the diagnosis are very poor. So typically, parents notice that something is wrong in those kids, and eventually they go to a medical doctor, and they try to say, you know, something is wrong, can you help us figure it out? And they take about 2 to 3 years to get a right diagnosis. This is all time that we are losing, right? There are 2-3 years, important years in which we could do something for those kids. And then, furthermore, there are no approved drugs for the treatment of those disorders. So we have to find some way to treat those children. Now, talking about serendipity, I actually, before I was just thinking, when did I kind of got this idea? And I remember I was coming back from holiday, which should teach me something, maybe. But I was coming back from holiday, and I say, well, but actually, we have the tools in the lab to do a better diagnosis, faster diagnosis, and eventually to find better treatments. And so that's where it all starts. So what we can do, next slide please, is to get skin biopsies, so just a little piece of skin from those kids, or a blood withdrawal. And from those cells, so from this little piece of skin, we can reprogram them in different steps to become neurons. This is, I think, is fantastic, because now, you know, the brain is not, so working with brain disorders is not working like cancer. We cannot just take parts of the brain out when the patient is alive. So we need somehow to get access to the material in another way, and that's what we do. So now we have the possibility of seeing those neurons and testing those neurons in a plate in the lab while those patients are still alive. And using those neurons, next slide, we can do a number of different tests, and we can combine all those tests to give us information about what the disorder really look like in those patients. And then get eventually a biomarker for, to test drugs for treatment, find way to accelerate the diagnosis of those disorders, and then eventually to really find better and novel treatments. So that's all what we can do next, please, is to develop a personalized diagnostics and drug development pipeline to eventually treat and diagnose these kids faster.
Thank you. Harold, CEO of Ribbon Biolabs and IST alumnus.
Thanks, Oliver. I think I was probably the first or second postdoc of IST ever. The first time I set foot here was in 2008, not 18, 8, so 11 years ago. Back then, I was becoming a postdoc with Nick Barton, and I worked in theoretical genetics until about that time, 2013. I left IST. And then I went on in my classic academic career. In the meantime, I was developing one project which was it's more like a user story, trying to very quickly reconstruct an ancestral population of viruses. The way we saw the world at the time is that, well, there's gene synthesis companies. We just go to a website, we type our genes there, we click buy, and in 3 days we'll get them by post, which was largely true in as long as you were buying very short strands of DNA. To our big disappointment, this was, of course, extremely expensive, and it would have taken months. We didn't have the funding for that, so we had to solve the problem in a very different way. Now, let's put that problem aside for a minute, or forever, for tonight. But something, you know how scientists work, you have something you can solve, it becomes kind of a little obsession that tick, 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 and sticks to your mind. This obsession became some sort of determination. We found after several months or after 1 year, a click on how we could actually solve our problem. And eventually I realized, hey, wait a minute, this does not solve our problem only. This actually is a new way of synthesizing DNA. And eventually, after a few years, that's what led to Ribbon Biolabs. Ribbon Biolabs is a company, it's a startup company hosted here in the IST Park, where we're developing a technology for the synthesis of long DNA molecules. And I'll explain in a minute why long. Right? What we are trying to do is to enable the synthetic biology vertical to actually develop new solutions in biotechnology. So briefly, I will explain what is the problem here. DNA synthesis essentially is like writing a sentence. So you go and you write letter by letter of what you want to express there, right? So this is pretty much how the technologies of DNA synthesis are working by chemical means adding nucleotide by nucleotide. The problem is that chemistry is very limited in this sense, and you can synthesize things up to 300 nucleotides. But when we think a genome has billions of nucleotides, right? So if we really want to go into synthetic biology with the power, as other technologies have done in the past century with physics and chemistry, we really have to break through these limits. So in Ribbon Biolabs, so what we are doing is a combination of biochemical methods as opposed to chemical methods, which are overlaid by computer science algorithms that are finding the best way to combine small pieces of DNA into long molecules. Essentially, it's as if we were writing an encyclopedia, not by word, but we would have a bag of syllables, right, which then we take in a smart way and combining in a parallel way to actually stitch together a long molecule of DNA. I know it's complicated, but we can explain more details later by the poster. The question now is, why do we want to do that? Well, first, because we can. Second, because it's fun. Third, because it gives money. And fourth, because we want to change the world. Now, being realistic, what happens here is that the new technologies that are being developed, and this is not anymore just a theoretical possibility, but actual technologies that are being developed require more and more complex DNA molecules. Examples are the biopharmaceutical industry, which requires very complicated genetic structures to express antibodies in cell lines, so we can actually satisfy a market of people in need of solutions. But I want to give a very last message here, which is the following. at the moment, as I mentioned, I'm in IST, and the way that I went from having an idea to the moment I could actually start a company, that was essentially a gap of 5 years. In that gap of 5 years, I was having my other academic positions and working actually literally in the evenings and the weekends. And at that time is when IST became handful again. I contacted Marcus Wanko. At that time, I think the Cube was not even existing, but he kindly organized. I could rent a lab here where I could develop a proof of concept. So I myself have to put in, me and my co-founder, thousands of about 25,000 of euros in order to get these things going, to get people convinced. That's when I realized actually that becoming an entrepreneur was reversing the value that we find in science. In science, we're generally getting funds to make science, and now as an entrepreneur, we're making science in order to make money. So when I look back, actually, this reversal was essentially the way in which we derived our original idea, which was rooted in an academic project, and by a serendipity fact, we managed to reverse the whole arrow of values and now become an entrepreneur, which is a flourishing company in IST Cube. Thank you.